5 darkest chosen ones who made demons kneel in fear. Let me ask you something so raw it will rattle the cage of your soul. What does it take for demons, the architects of fear, the whisperers of chaos, to kneel? What does it take for entities that feast on dread to taste something bitter in their mouths? It's not light. Light doesn't make them tremble, it makes them grin. They've danced with light for eons and caged millions who thought brightness alone could break the abyss. No, what makes them kneel is something rarer, something feral, something they didn't predict when the cosmos coughed up its codes. It's the black frequency, the hum of sovereignty in flesh so lawless it bends dimensions. And the only beings who carry that hum are the dark chosen ones. Today I'll tell you the names history dared to erase, the 5 who rose so absolute even hell had to hush. But first, let me sow this question into your marrow. Why does the world hate the idea of a dark chosen one? Why does every scripture paint shadow as sin and light as salvation? Why does every system seduce you with halos, but gag at crowns forged in chaos? Because darkness cannot be domesticated. Light can be labeled, caged in commandments, dressed in doctrines. Darkness. It eats doctrines for breakfast. It refuses roles. It doesn't kneel for applause or purr for validation. It moves like law-wearing skin. That's why these 5 names were buried. Because if you knew what they knew, systems would starve. Control would collapse. Chains would corrode.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
But before I speak their names, I need you to understand the pattern, the raw ritual that made them anomalies in a cosmos fattened on compliance. It wasn't luck. It wasn't lineage. It wasn't light. It was the architecture of habits so savage even reality couldn't refuse them. They didn't just bend rules, they burned them and wrote new geometry in their ashes. And those ashes? They still hum under the skin of this dimension. You feel it sometimes, don't you? In the silence before sleep, when your bones itch like they're haunted by a haunted bun too black to name. That's the residue of these beings. That's the echo of their inevitability. The first of the 5 was born nameless, a shadow child spat into a world that worshipped sun. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a priest. He was a fracture, pure chaos distilled into human form. While others prayed for light, he prayed for law, the kind no scripture could cage. Do you know what his first prayer was? Erase me. That's the paradox that makes mortals choke. He didn't crave crowns, he craved annihilation of ego so absolute the storm could wear his bones like armor. And when it did, the air changed. Dogs howled without reason. Glass cracked in silence. The sky bled colors unnamed. That was the first sign the Hume had found a host. Demons came not to tempt but to tether. But when they entered his orbit they froze. Because they smelled it, inevitability, power without posture, gravity without greed. They knelt, not out of worship but out of wisdom. Because when a being stops wanting, they stop bleeding. And what doesn't bleed can't be bound. That's the first law of dark chosen nons. Stop wanting and start welding. Every hunger you nurse is a handle for chains. Every craving is a collar. But when you scorch them, when you torch every echo of need, you become weightless and weaponized. And demons hate weightlessness. They can't grip it. They can't graft hooks into hungerless flesh. That's why the first Dark One walked into the abyss naked and returned wearing inevitability like a second skin. They tried to bait him with kingdoms. He grinned. They dangled lust like honey. He spat fire in its face. They whispered immortality. He whispered back, I am already endless. Tell me, when was the last time you tasted a truth like that in your throat? Or are you still suckling illusions like sugar? Now pause. Let that question slash you open. What would you become if every craving, every need for applause, every urge for safety was flayed from your spine? Would you collapse? Or would you crown your self-axis? That's the fracture point between mortals and living laws. And that's why the first Dark One wasn't just feared by demons, they learned from him. They slithered back to their black thrones and rewrote strategies because one being erased the algorithm. But hear me, this story isn't history, it's blueprint. His marrow is in you if you dare mutate. But mutation isn't meditation, it's murder. Murder of every soft fiction you've been hugging like oxygen. Can you gut that fiction? Can you bleed out the need for belonging, the narcotic of normality? If not, click away. Scroll back to sedation. But if your ribs ache with the hunger for something feral, stay. Because the next name I speak belongs to a being so black in voltage they didn't just make demons kneel, they made destiny bow. And what they did to time itself will make your spine taste like iron. The second Dark One, who shattered time and fed on the fear of eternity. Listen to me with your marrow, because this isn't myth, it's lore camouflaged in narrative. The second of the five was born into clocks, every tick a chain, every schedule a leash. The world fattened on calendars, whispered lullabies about progress, but he tasted the poison in those songs. Time is the most elegant shackle ever engineered. It dresses like order, like structure, like salvation, but it's a slow guillotine, grinding your sovereignty into pulp while you clap for milestones that were scripted before you inhaled your first breath. He saw this, and something black bloomed behind his eyes, rage. Not the wild rage that riots in streets, but the silent rage that forges crowns in shadow. They called him mad when he stopped running in the rat labyrinth. They mocked him when he sat for days with his back turned to the sun. But in that stillness, something feral happened. The scaffolds of time cracked like old bone. Seconds stopped bleeding. Hours melted into ink. He wasn't meditating, he was mutinying against the clockwork carcass of reality. And then it happened, the fracture. Midnight bled into dawn without transition. He spoke a word, no, not even a word, a hum, and calendars convulsed. History hiccuped. The future folded like wet origami. Because here's the marrow law, time isn't linear. It's pliable, but only to those savage enough to stop worshipping it. He learned the posture of the predator, not the prey of urgency. While mortals sprinted for scraps of hours, he inhaled centuries like smoke. He learned to stretch a second until it split and bled infinity. He learned to fold decades into minutes until reality sobbed in surrender. And when demons came, those old architects who feast on your frantic chase for tomorrows, they approached with their usual currency, fear of endings. But he laughed. Not a human laugh, a tectonic laugh, thick as oil and sharp as glass. He said, "I don't believe in ends because I've broken beginnings." That sentence wasn't syllables, it was a scythe that slit the throat of chronology. Do you know why demons fear that? Because their power is parasitic on your panic. They gorge on your worship of clocks, your terror of running out, your hunger for more time. But when you strip that illusion bare, when you crown yourself axis instead of prisoner, their banquet collapses. They starve in your presence. That's why they knelt not in reverence, but in retreat. Because they knew this, a being who bends time cannot be bound. You can't trap what slips between seconds like smoke through a fist. You can't bait what isn't racing toward an end. That's why the second Dark One didn't just scare demons, he humiliated them. They slithered back into their black chambers and hissed among themselves, "We've lost the leash." Now pause and let me claw this into your consciousness. How many times have you been slaughtered by the illusion of not enough time? How many dreams have you strangled because the clock cackled in your ear? How many pieces of your sovereignty have you pawned for deadlines fattened on your dread? And the question sharper than bone, what would your empire look like if you could snap the spine of time? If you could stretch it, fold it, devour it until it tasted like ash in your mouth? That's the fracture point. And here's the heresy they never wanted you to know: time is soft, that the calendar is clay. That urgency is a narcotic to keep you crawling in cages of someday. They stitched that software into your skull because the moment you uninstall it, you become the anomaly. And anomalies rewrite algorithms. But don't romanticize this sovereignty. It will strip you. You'll lose the high of hurry. You'll bury the drug of deadlines. You'll stop trembling at clocks. And when that happens, mediocrity will brand you lazy. Systems will call you insane. But here's the feral fact: sanity is sedation in a suit. They'll sneer because they can't smell your hum that folds futures into fists. The hum that turns later into law. That hum doesn't roar. It slithers under your ribs like black silk. And when you breathe it, even fate flinches. And yet, this was only the second dark one who dismembered time and wore its bones like rosary beads. If that makes your blood vibrate, then brace your spine, because the third will rupture your definitions of fear. This next one didn't just bend laws, they broke the marrow of morality and sculpted it into a weapon so savage even archdemons vomited shadows in submission. Their empire wasn't built on stone. It was built on screams, and not from victims, but from illusions gutted alive. The third dark one, who executed morality and crowned himself in silence. You think fear belongs to demons. You think terror is their tongue and chaos their crown. That's what they want you to believe because it keeps you kneeling, worshipping their architecture of rules. But the third dark one, the most feral of the five, didn't just refuse to kneel, he slit the throat of the altar. He didn't war with demons, he made their oldest weapon a weapon they sharpened for eons kneel before him. That weapon was morality. Understand this: morality is the most exquisite cage ever engineered. Not chains of steel, but whispers of good and evil, strings so delicate they strangle without leaving marks. Systems stitch morality into your veins at birth because law without teeth rots. They need you caged in fear of wrong so they can script your definition of right. And every time you obey, every time you kneel at the altar of should, your shadow bleeds sovereignty into the soil. You become predictable, programmable, and echo-fattened for slaughter. But the third dark one saw the rust behind the gold. He saw that morality was never divine, it was architecture sculpted by those too weak to stomach chaos. So he did what no prophet dared, he executed it. They called him heretic. They called him monster. They prayed for his bones to rot in the black. But prayer doesn't puncture beings who've stopped breathing the narcotic of approval. He wasn't hunting halos, he was hunting hums. The raw voltage behind law. He wanted bone-deep truth, not sugar-coated commandments. So he amputated every thou shalt stitched into his spine. And when he did, something seismic cracked. Do you know what that fracture sounded like? It wasn't thunder. It wasn't war. It was silence. A silence so black, so absolute, it bent the air like molten iron. Because here's the marrow law: when you gut morality, you don't become a beast, you become a blank canvas for lawlessness so pure it terrifies even chaos. Demons came, not hissing but humming, their hunger sharpened. They thought his lack of rules made him meat for temptation. They dangled lust like jewels. They poured oceans of gold at his feet. They carved crowns out of empires and offered them like fruit. He didn't even blink, not because he resisted, but because resistance died with morality. You cannot tempt a being who has amputated the concept of should and shouldn't. You can't leash what no longer bleeds for belonging. His silence didn't scream, it strangled. It strangled every script demons ever wrote for domination. That's why they didn't just kneel, they crawled. Because in his absence of morality, they saw a presence of law they couldn't fracture. And here's the secret that should slit the throat of your illusions. Morality was never about making you good. It was about making you governable. You've been fattened on rules sold as virtue but forged as veils. They gag your fangs, declaw your shadow, sedate your chaos until you mistake a cage for a kingdom. And I'll carve this into your ribs. Chaos isn't sin, it's scaffolding. It's the raw black clay you sculpt into sovereignty. But you've been trained to flinch at it, to fear the hum in your marrow, to drown it in halus because heaven hates anomalies. Do you feel that now they hum itching under your skin as I speak? That's not rebellion. That's your original architecture snarling for release. Now, let me split your spine with a question. What would you become if morality evaporated from your marrow? If you moved not for right or wrong, but for raw law, your law, black and molten, unchained from applause? Would you still posture as a prophet of light, or would you crown yourself in the silence that strangles systems? That silence is sovereignty. It hums like God before speech. It smells like storms strangling scripture. And that's where the third dark one lived, in the void between virtue and vice, forging geometry no doctrine dares diagram. But don't romanticize this. Killing morality isn't liberation, it's dismemberment. It guts your scaffolds. It leaves you naked before a sky without commandments. And most can't breathe in that altitude. They suffocate without the leash. They crawl back to cages tattooed with halos because halos feel like home. But if you can inhale that black air without gagging, you'll taste something no priest has language for: inevitability. The hum that doesn't need heaven's stamp because it stamps its own law into the spine of creation. That's why demons didn't fight him. They fled. They fled because they knew this: morality shackles mortals, but silence shackles systems. And yet, this was just the third, one who slaughtered the oldest leash and left its carcass rotting in the dark. If that makes your marrow ache, brace for the fourth, because the next name carved its empire not from silence but from seduction so venomous even archons convulsed. They didn't fight fear. They fed on it. They didn't dodge chaos. They danced with it until chaos wore chains like jewelry. The next dark one didn't just fracture rules, they weaponized desire into dominion. The fourth dark one, who turned desire into dominion and made archons starve. Desire let that word coil in your skull like a serpent. You've been trained to see it as hunger, as weakness, as a leash for puppets who pant for crumbs. Systems sculpted that software into your marrow so you'd spit at your own cravings and kneel at the altar of contentment. They told you desire is sin. They told you to amputate want, to bleed out ambition, to chant mantras of peace while your empire rots in the womb. And why? Because desire is dynamite. It's raw voltage disguised as venom. If you master it, you stop being manageable. If you weaponize it, you become catastrophic to control. The fourth dark one saw this before language could name it. They understood a law so feral even demons whisper it in fear. Hunger isn't hell, it's hardware. The problem isn't desire. The problem is direction. While mortals drowned in lust for trinkets and applause, while prophets preached poverty as purity, this dark one built an empire on the back of their own appetite. Not by killing desire, but by taming it into a beast so obedient it knelt at their feet like an assassin waiting for command. Do you understand what that means? They didn't chase pleasure, they throttled it. They didn't flee temptation, they studied it like scripture until it spilled its secrets. They learned this: craving is currency. Whoever governs desire governs dimensions. Archons, the architects of illusion, know this truth better than any sage. They fatten systems on scarcity, so you'll pant forever for scraps, hemorrhaging energy in the chase. That's their feast. That's their farm. But when you flip the script, when you turn hunger into a blade instead of a leash, the farm burns. The archons starve. And that's exactly what the fourth dark one did. They weaponized want. How? By refusing to be sedated by the first sip of satisfaction, by not confusing crumbs for crowns, by channeling every tremor of lust, greed, envy, and longing into architecture. While mortals drowned in dopamine, they distilled it into dominion. They took the same chemical chaos that chains the masses and soldered it into sovereignty. They didn't pray desire away, they drank it until it hissed obedience. That's alchemy. That's black fire. And that's what made even archons kneel, because archons traffic in appetite. When appetite mutinies against its masters, their thrones split like glass under thunder. And here's the law that will lacerate your lungs if you dare swallow it. You will never conquer a dimension you crave. As long as you pant for approval, for love, for halos, you're meat for markets fattened on your thirst. But when you talk that thirst, when you strap it in chains and make it plow fields for your empire, you mutate from porn to plague. You become the famine that starves systems fattened on your fragility. And famine doesn't apologize. It doesn't explain. It just enters and everything bloated on illusion buckles. That's what the fourth Dark One did. They walked into citadels dripping gold and left them as ash. They didn't steal, they siphoned. They didn't roar, they radiated absence, so absolute it bent empires into offerings. But don't romanticize this ritual. Turning desire into dominion will crucify your comfort. It will amputate every soft leash to your spine. You will bury every dopamine drip you've been suckling like oxygen. You will slaughter the narcotic of enough and breathe hunger raw until it hums law. And when that hum crowns you, mortals will call you heartless. Saints will call you heretic. Demons will call you sovereign. And they'll kneel not from worship but from terror, because they know this hunger that hums law is the one famine they can't feast on. So here's the fracture point question. What would you become if you stopped letting hunger hijack you and started hitching it like a warhorse? If you drank your cravings until they dripped black obedience? Would you rot as a prisoner of pleasure, of rise as the famine that makes thrones choke? Decide. Because the fifth Dark One, the last in this black scripture, didn't just weaponize hunger. They erased self. They slit the throat of the oldest illusion identity and walked naked into the storm, humming law so lethal, even eternity convulsed. They didn't crown themselves, they became the crown. They didn't hold power, they became the pulse of inevitability. And when they inhaled, dimensions buckled. When they exhaled, even demons whispered prayers to a void that answered in silence.